Hey everyone, and welcome to Private, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek Silva. Today we're speaking with Greg Osuri. Greg is a renowned open source developer and the co founder and CEO of Akash Network, and has transformed the future of cloud computing. Prior to Akash, Greg founded AngelHack, the world's largest hackathon organization with over 200,000 developers across 164 cities all around the globe. Greg, thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thanks so much, Derek. Super excited to be here.
Good. So let's start off with some real basics here. What is Akash Network?
So, in the simplest terms, Akash is the world's first open source cloud. So, it's a permissionless, non custodial, and self sustaining economy built in purpose for cloud computing. At its core, it has a reverse auction marketplace that essentially lets the user set the price, and providers, anyone with a computer, essentially a data center, could participate in this reverse auction and bid to run your workloads, thereby truly setting a market-driven pricing model for the cloud, which is the first time we ever saw something like this exist. And the results are obviously very beneficial for the users. Some users experience anywhere from 8x cost savings switching from Amazon to Akash. And more importantly, they can do their savings in a fully controlled and fully sovereign way without having a permissionless way, which is very exciting.
That's really terrific. I mean, like that's huge cost savings. I rent some servers. I've run my own web hosting business before, so I have a really good idea of what it takes to use either bare metal or cloud servers, VPSs, in order to spin them up, cost out what you actually need compute wise, storage wise. So 8x savings potential. That's actually huge. So good on you for getting to that point. Where did your interest in decentralized cloud computing start?
So, if you had to trace back, I think it goes all the way to my time at AngelHack. So, AngelHack is where I got incredible opportunity to work with amazing set of developers, even help launch some great companies such as Firebase, which eventually got acquired by Google. But the experience
Yeah.
that I got at AngelHack working with developers under duress really made me focus on this deployment problem. So when developers create their applications, and the next step is to take those applications and make them available to the users, they have to move these workloads to a dedicated computer or a data center, right? So, and that process, especially when you do it in a collaborative way, seemed extraneous. And that seemed to be the biggest source of friction. So 2013, I decided to focus on this problem in a more full-time capacity, and started working on this new technologies called Linux containers back then. This is right before Docker
Mm.
existed and right before all the flair we see today. Stumbled upon this technology because it was very promising, especially to solve the parity problem. What happens when you build something locally and deploy that without having too much of a difference, right? So it was very fascinating.
Right.
Founded it, and I stumbled onto another technology in 2014 called Kubernetes. Before anyone knew about what this was, started contributing to Kubernetes and started using it pretty heavily. Uh, Created a company called Overclock Labs to take Kubernetes to market. Kubernetes was a very early, very niche technology at that time. Right now, it's so massive that it's used by 80% of the cloud. Um, and so we were the company that was taking Kubernetes to market, and it was great. So one of the core essentials of what we're building is really to get sovereignty back to developers. Cloud was just sort of like getting bigger and bigger, and the tool chain was increasingly getting misaligned from the user, right? Developers, what they want versus what they get is getting very far apart. And so the idea was to
Yeah.
rebuild and get some sovereignty back to the user. And we built this amazing pass system based on Kubernetes. And while we were deploying to the data centers that would install this application, we found out that 85% or so of data centers the capacity in these data centers remain unused, right? So there was a
Wow, that's
it's
high.
fairly high. Actually, that's more of our conservative numbers, right? I think the reality is somewhere around 90% or more. And the reason for that is
Hmm.
you plan for peak, and as you know, you ran data centers before. You always get boxes that you need to use in peak loads, right? So most of the time you're not running at peak, so you have these boxes available. So that's when the idea of like creating a marketplace came about. And when we wanted to create this marketplace, we wanted to make sure it is open. It is not part of the bigger problem in itself. And we wanted to keep this open source, right? Both in terms of access as well as source code. And we were, all and from a technical standpoint, we were sort of like developing like a system that was decentralized from the get-go because when you have to deploy something to an edge server where you have very little control, you want it to be healing or self-operating, right, as much as possible. Right, you want less manual intervention.
Hmm.
So in that way, we developed a
Right.
very developed something that kind of adopts a Merkle tree structure to data synchronization and uses BitTorrent style synchronization and Merkle tree for
Oh,
integrity.
cool.
So when you put BitTorrent and Merkle together, you end up with a blockchain, right? So this was in 2016, 2017 timeframe. We were like, well, we wanted to, number one, create an open ecosystem where the access is permissionless, the control is permissionless, and the source code is available for anyone to use. Number two, we wanted a system, a cloud deployment system that has immediate consistency. And we really like the data structures that get Merkle trees style and the replication that we get with BitTorrent. And number three, we wanted to create a self-sustaining ecosystem where we don't even without us it can function by itself with removing us out of the equation, right? And when we put all these three together, we ended up with crypto, and that's the story of how Akash ended up as a crypto project.
Okay, that's terrific. You talked about using currently underutilized services or completely unutilized boxes servers, and obviously cost is probably a problem for a significant number of people and even businesses, especially depending on the resources they have available, which is often largely a function of where they're born, essentially. So, can you talk a little bit more about how decentralizing cloud computing in this way benefits businesses and people?
Right. So I grew up in India on a farm, right? So for me to get access to a computer was very, very prohibitive. I didn't own a computer till I was in college, really, but I did learn how to code when I was 8, mostly through books, and information was very hard to get by, right? So
Hmm.
if you put someone like me, right now there are millions of kids without access to that level of computing, right? And as you know, the needs of a developer is increasingly getting bigger, and the needs of and the data size that we're processing is exponential, I believe, doubling every 2 years. Um, so
Hmm.
there, and while there is this enormous amounts of demand for computing, and where you have this enormous supply for computing, uh, I don't see a reason why this supply should not meet demand, and I don't see a reason why we have middlemen taking advantage of this demand and essentially seeking rent and essentially controlling a lot. So right now, about
Right.
81% of market share is controlled by 4 companies, right? And it is about to be $1 trillion market by 2025. It is a massive market. And if you think about cloud, everything today goes on the cloud. It is a fabric for today's society. So when you see how important it is, the kind of role it plays in our daily lives, without even realizing, everyone pays an Amazon tax, right? It's invisible tax, right? So if you look at how
Hmm.
important that is, um, and if you look at how big it's going to grow and the demand is increasing, and if you look at it, there's enormous supply that's actually there. I just don't. I think it's a dumb problem to connect supply with demand, and the result is obviously the cost benefit because what happens when you supply meets demand, right? You're going to see a cost reduction because that's just nature of economics. So yes, I think, and
Right.
if you look at how prohibitive it is right now for some of the data intensive companies such as AI or blockchain, sorry, AI mostly, blockchain to a certain degree, AI, um, it is prohibitive to run on the cloud, right? It is. Andreessen wrote an article recently that that basically said 20% of margins for AI companies goes to Amazon. So it is so big that it is actually hurting their
Wow.
viability to exist as a business. It's no longer a secondary cost; it is a primary cost, sometimes much more than payroll. You know, so if you look at how
Hmm.
big of a problem that it is, anything we can contribute to solve that problem, I think we should definitely pursue, right? So I'm particularly excited about AI workloads on Akash, and happy to chat more why I think that's the future. But yes, making demand meet supply or supply meet demand is a way to go in the future of the cloud.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I do want to dig a little bit more into the AI discussion. Um, part of Akasha's rollout has been an arrangement with Equinix, which is a massive data center operator, not typically a direct to consumer approach. Certainly, like if you're a large enough company, you could probably call Equinix and say we need a couple of racks. But they operate at a fairly large scale. I used to work for a large web hosting company that had Equinix as a vendor, so I've got a little bit of familiarity with their contracts and arrangements. Um, and you've also got this mini supercomputer that you guys are having built. You got pre-orders available for
Somewhere here,
Americans right now. Hopefully, shipping.
it's not turned on, but here.
Let's see it. Nice. Oh, that's a really cool
Let's see.
design. I must say. Oh wow, like it's like a mirror on the one side. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the impacts of those two things. You got Equinix as a partner. I think it's 220 data centers across the world. You've got these mini supercomputers being built. How to
I know what is going on here, right?
like how are those two how are those two things coming together in your mind in terms of helping democratize I guess the network as a whole, and also making sure that let's say mission critical loads are up and running. I guess that would be a big part of the Equinix
Correct.
collaboration.
So so the way you look at Akash is the best analogy I would give is if Akash is Airbnb, Amazon is Hilton, right? So Akash is a
Okay.
very versatile system, so much so that you can have both very mission critical infrastructure that's running in Amazon on sorry on Equinix, which is the largest interconnected data center network in the world, to devices that can live in the home with varying degrees of reliability. And there are certain use cases for that box as well. So it's so versatile that it can support both the use cases. So that's amazing, right? But when I said you look at
Yeah.
Akash is like Airbnb because there are about 8.2 million data centers in the world with varying degrees
Wow.
of speciality. There are exotic offerings where you have data centers literally sitting right in the same network as a cell tower. Two data centers that offer you enormously low latency transfer rates somewhere north of like less than 10 milliseconds between LA and San Francisco or major metros, right? And
Hmm.
there are data centers that will be built in space, right? So there is going to be data centers, and there are data centers in the ocean right now, right? People are building stuff, right?
Yes.
So
Yeah, well, I think Microsoft has one off the coast of Scotland, something like that, water cooled. Not like obviously not the water inside around the servers, but like they're using water from the Atlantic Ocean essentially as part of their water cooling infrastructure there.
right, so there's so much diversity in the types of data centers that are coming online. And that's what Akash is for.
Hmm.
Akash is for unlocking those data centers, right? Whereas Amazon is like Hilton, where you get the same standard coffee, same standard breakfast, same brands of sheets, no matter what Hilton you go to. And it's great for consistency. I mean, people like that kind of consistency, and it's great for that type of
Sure.
users. So Akash is like the Airbnb model, where you can get this variety of compute, which is very unique because there's nothing like this in the marketplace right now. So we began with Equinix because that's the most we optimize for reliability and we optimize for mission critical workloads. Um, but as we expand out, we are starting to see a lot more actually people listing their compute themselves is because it's permissionless. But I think we're going to see quite a
Hmm.
bit of like uh, that more. And now the users have the option to choose what data center they want to go to. And again, and that's very critical because now you have different levels of security, right? Something like a box, like a super mini, which is in the home, which is less in this less what do you call uh, low trust environment that lives in, right? Like the use cases for this is more machine learning, right? Whereas something that is
Right.
sitting in Equinix, which has got tier four level data centers, right? Which is essentially, every anyone that access to the have that access to the machines have background checks and logs and that level of security, right? So I guess when you're like the user should have the option to choose the level of security that they want, and you pay a premium for higher security services, or a discount for lower security services. If you're running something like machine learning, you need low trust. If you're running something like a financial data set, you probably need like high trust, right? Like, so I think that is where Akash really
Yeah.
comes into play. It's very, very powerful because you can choose the level of trustability, and that all that is configurable by the user to the amount they want to pay. You could say have like some machine learning workloads that are really optimizing for they're just crunching numbers. You're just crunching weather data, which is public. You don't really need like the level of trust that like for conduct that you have
Yeah.
for conducting like a private transaction.
Yeah, no, that's terrific. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask, like, can I choose whether my workload gets deployed on a super mini in Ukraine sitting at somebody's house, which is probably going to be much lower cost, and like you just said, I don't need a lot of trust. This is publicly accessible data, or it's encrypted in transit and at rest anyway. Like I've configured a Kubernetes environment or a Docker container or something like that. That's all self-contained, versus this other option, like, yeah, I do want the data to be at Equinix or something like that, and so I want to choose that option. So that's terrific that you're already making that option available. um, before the super mini comes out, can you talk a little bit about what the process is like of actually bringing compute and storage power to the Akash network? Like if I had another machine here at home, or if I was renting a machine already at another data center, what's that process in brief look like to actually get it onboarded?
So it's fairly straightforward. You can go to docs.akash.network and there's a guide there on how to become a provider. You need
Okay.
a functioning Kubernetes cluster where that's already in place,
Okay.
and then you can just go install the software and you're good to go. You can become a provider. Now, um, there's a second part.
Do we need to stake?
You don't need to
Do we
say
need to stake any AKT
no. There's
tokens?
none of
No.
that
Okay.
required. There is a second part though. So because it is a low trust environment, we have this feature called audited attributes. Essentially, the big question, overwhelming question is like, how do I know whether to trust, Derek's home computer? Like, what are the guarantees Derek
Hmm.
is not going to open up my box and look into stuff like that, right? Like, so for that, we have something called audited attributes, where it's essentially a decentralized auditing system where we uh, sort of like it, the way you think of this is like uh, a web of trust system, right? So users can
Okay.
choose to trust a third party that has a public profile, and that third party will audit the attributes for Derek, right? For you. So in your data center, say you're an Equinix or someone like that, we audit, we do an offline KYC, we do an offline, um, you know, attributes like reference, whether you saw compliance, and you have all these things that cannot be done online, and we audit those attributes and we give you we publish it on chain the users can trust that auditor, thereby trusting the data center that these guys are legit, right? So for you, right? So that's really how we kind of like manage trust. It's a more scalable way in a more pragmatic way than on-chain trust, essentially, right? Because on-chain trust limits the amount of the kind of applications you can develop, whereas a model like us kind of
Sure.
mimics the real world trust framework. Like, how do you trust Amazon because you know they're Amazon? How do you trust Google because you know they're Google, right? So we're kind of extending that trust mechanism to the real world. So that's, if you want to apply for now, you can still list your compute, and if there's a user that doesn't care about getting audited and getting into this like, you know, premium level, they can still use a compute, or you can start your own audit chain too. So it's one of those things that people need to choose,
Okay.
like similar to like token lists. You know, if you go to Uniswap, how do you know it's the real token? Like, you know, how do you know it's some random ERC token that's listing AKT? And it happens a lot on Uniswap, right? Like a lot of folks think it's
Yeah.
AKT, and
Yeah.
AKT is not ERC20 token, and people buy. So Uniswap came up with this solution called token lists, where it's very similar. They have an audited
Hmm.
token list, where, you know, one list is provided by CoinGecko, who does an offline auditing of identity, and publishes that. So it kind of extends that idea into Akash as well.
Okay, that's neat. That's a good analogy there with the Uniswap list. I think that's easily understandable. Um, so you've gotten this far. The network works. People can. You obviously you love Kubernetes. People can bring a Kubernetes cluster to the network, or wait for the super mini. Hopefully later this year, unless the chip shortage persists, and maybe that delays your plans. But that's not really within your control. Um, what's your long-term goal for Akash Network? Like, what does scaling beyond your current point look like for you?
So for us, like, we want to be, well, in the near term goal to long term goal, right? So near term goal and the long term goal actually kind of like uh, merge. Really, we want to be the cloud computing network for the modern developer, right? So where the big guys are losing out is understanding modern developer needs, and providing them services and solution to address those needs. And they're too focused on getting larger enterprises onto cloud. We want to be the developer
Right.
cloud, right? And we are open source, we're self-sovereign, we're permissionless. We really put the developer in the center of everything we do, right? So obviously the platform right now is designed to be very developer first. It doesn't have a UI, it doesn't have any of those bells and whistles. So, and the idea is we even though we could build all the stuff, we rather have a community build. That way, we have a lot more buy-in from the community, which community is actually building right now, right? So a long-term vision for us is
Hmm.
to have an ecosystem of builders on top of Akash that are profiting off or making a living on Akash, you know, and it's not one single company like Amazon or Google that's benefiting from this cloud. We want to see as distributed prosperity as much as distributed as possible, right? And that's really where we're going with long term. And we want to, and you know, there's so many problems that we need to solve. Uh, you know, if you look at problems with like what's happening today with Amazon and open source, right? Amazon is I mean, large open source companies, and small ones, they just don't know it yet. Especially larger open source companies kind of have contention. If you look at what Elasticache sued Amazon for stealing their business model, right? So Amazon's business model is they take
Oh,
open source software, they white label that open source software, and they call it their own, and they offer these
yeah.
services at a premium. Like
Right.
Elasticache is a open source software, it's a search server. Amazon, you know, sort of like offer that service as a premium service. They charge hosting fees without giving anything back to Elastic. I think that's fundamentally broken because that limits the amount of things open source developers can do in order to sustain
Hmm.
themselves. And that's really one of the areas that we want to help fix. Like we want to ensure that open source stays innovative and sustainable, while you know there's a market and there's user base, right? So Our mission really is to be the open source cloud serving open source community, and that benefits the society as well as the developers in a prosperity matrix that's a lot more distributed than a single company earning all the keeping all the prosperity.
Cool. Um, let's go back to that AI topic because I think that's definitely AI, mostly machine learning, which is kind of like a prerequisite for actual, a machine actually thinking for itself. But certainly collecting data, having a computer crunch through that data in a reasonable amount of time, whatever that means to the
Yep.
developer, that is certainly something that's happening more and more and more. You talk a little bit more about what Akash is doing there to help either speed up that process, enable that process, make it more affordable. Like, what's your focus there, or what were the points you wanted to talk about earlier?
Yeah, so like I said, like 20% of margins go to Amazon, which is very expensive for a lot of these AI companies. So
Mm-hmm.
what they're doing is they're trying to offset some of the costs by bringing in the workloads to their offices. So if you go to a lot of machine learning companies, you'll normally see like a rack or two, in their offices having the GPU cluster. Is a very common sight, right? And I've seen this quite a bit. And
Okay.
so they tend to use this. Most of the cost of machine learning is the learning side of things. So they tend to use them while learning, maybe a couple of hours a day. But when they peak, when they want to really, during that time, and they normally peak because the loads are unpredictable, right? So you don't really get the peak capacity, right? It's too expensive. So they do end up
Right.
using the cloud to some degree, which they hate, but it kind of helps the offsetting the cost of bringing in the GPUs in house. The big problem there is you're only using them maybe 2 to 3 hours a day. 20 hours you're sitting there idle. In a case like that, they can install Akash and essentially earn tokens for these 20 hours. And when they really want to
Okay.
use them, they can use Akash tokens, to effectively get the cost low. So this is a scenario where the tenant becomes the provider and vice versa, really creating a true peer-to-peer cloud for AI. And I think that is a fundamentally a game changer. We have millions of dollars worth of uh, we have customers with big, highly qualified leads with millions of dollars worth of spend that all want GPU. Like at this rate, we get 1 or 2 requests a week to enable GPU capacity on Akash. So we're going to take this very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And the big difference between us and the rest of the GPU cloud is if we have a few projects in blockchain that focus on GPU, we can run anything that you can run on Amazon on Akash, right? That's very, very important. You can run a Terraform, sorry, a TensorFlow cluster on Akash with very little configuration change, whereas the rest of the projects and ecosystem mandate you to re, re-architect or rewrite everything in their programming language. So, and that's prohibitive for a lot of the
Right.
folks, right? That's like, it's not okay. No one wants to write complete to change your cloud providers. You shouldn't rewrite your code base. So, and another interesting event that is going to happen over the next couple of years is Ethereum moving off um, proof of work and coming to proof of stake unlocks enormous
Yeah.
amount of computing. And this is the trend we are seeing quite a bit of proof of stake replacing proof of work in several other protocols too. So there's enormous amount of like GPUs that are being unlocked, and we want to offer that to a customer base that's really like suffering quite a bit right now, right? So we're super excited about GPU
Yeah.
marketplace. We are solving the multi-tenancy problem for GPUs, and once that's solved, we'll have a more functioning marketplace on Akash.
Will you be able to apply that same similar thing to that same thing to the ASICs that are being used to mine Ethereum now, or any ASICs in general?
ASICs were very, very specialized processors. I mean, now if you're using the same
Yes.
function as an Ethereum, node, we definitely can. But I mean, it doesn't stop you, right? Akash doesn't stop you from essentially listing that compute, as long as there is a provider,
Hmm.
or sorry, a tenant that'll use that particular ASIC function, right? Which I doubt. I mean, but if there is a provider, that'd be fantastic, right? If there's a user that needs this function and they can list on Akash, um, I can't quite tell yet um, what level of customization the attributes are going to have when it comes to ASIC, right?
Hmm.
We haven't quite figured out
Okay.
how do you come up with this attribute set for GPUs themselves, right? They're not like CPUs; they're like completely different, you know, uh,
Yeah. No.
completely
Yeah.
different units.
Absolutely. They're very, very different.
So,
Yeah.
but that's something to keep in mind. I think like ASIC enabling an ASIC marketplace is also going to be fun. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah. I wasn't expecting a, oh yeah, for sure. Like we could totally do that. I know enough to know that ASICs are very specialized processors. I won't call them CPUs because they're really not processors that do, very specific things. Like you need to design this specific ASIC for this mining algorithm specifically for Ethereum, or it might be the same mining algorithm for a few different blockchains. Scrypt comes to mind, but regardless, yeah, it's a very specialized use case, obviously, and yeah, you're right. By the time we move off of the majority of workloads off of proof of work, Ethereum obviously being one of the bigger ones, um, yeah, there might not be a market for those. So hopefully, I guess that stuff can be recycled physically somehow and turned back into things we will need by then. Um, so you and I have both been at this for a few years in terms of being in the blockchain space. You much longer than me, and all credit to you for that. I'm just curious about how you think Web 3.0 technologies, decentralization, how that's going to change the internet in the future.
Well, I think I mean, I think we're going to see the same level of, if not bigger level of transformation as to what Web 2 did to Web 1 and vice versa. I mean, and further down,
Hmm.
what Web 1 did to no web, right? Um, it
Right.
presented ways in which people do things that were not predictable, especially from no internet to the internet. And I think that is going to
Hmm.
fundamentally, we're going to see that in Web 3, right? So we can't quite say how or what is going to come out of it, right? But we're starting to see um, product market fit, and that product market fit will turn it into essentially the only way to do things, right? So we're seeing, well, DeFi obviously is done fairly well when it comes to product market fit. We're seeing some level of product market fit
Yeah.
with NFTs or digital rights tracking on the blockchain, right? Uh, Even though we prophesized about some of these use cases a while back, but we're just starting to see some of them take hold. And the good news is it started already, and we're going to see more and more of these come online. I think if I have to draw some predictions, I think a big part of innovation is going to be in open marketplaces, right? Open way of exchanging goods and services in an open way, right? In a transparent way. I think that's going to be the theme. If you look at NFTs or if you look at DeFi, these are effectively marketplaces. People are exchanging goods and services without a middleman, right? And that's going to be the trend moving forward. And um, uh, I see no reason why any application, any marketplace today should be closed. Marketplace by definition should be open and free, right? So in DWeb
Right.
alone, we're starting to see um, every component of the cloud getting decentralized. If we look at DNS, it's getting decentralized by Handshake. What you guys are doing in Orchid is phenomenal when it comes to decentralizing bandwidth, right? Essentially, it's a bandwidth marketplace if you look at it from a different lens, right?
Yeah.
And third, what we're doing in Akash is we're decentralizing cloud compute. If you look at storage, Saya, Skynet, they're decentralizing storage, incredible product. Um, so we're seeing new Cipher that's decentralized key management, right? So we have every like part of the stack that's getting decentralized. We're still in the primitive stage. We're still building some of those primitives. There's still no um, easy or super smooth and frictionless way to use these technologies, but that'll get solved, right? Um, I think a big transformation will be from like a password-based or account-based system to a wallet-first system, right? And
Yeah.
if you look at some of the things that are happening right now, uh, to further decentralize ecosystem is interoperability. Akash really became the second blockchain to enable interoperability with Cosmos IBC, implementation. So now we are able to see asset transfer between two sovereign blockchains from Atom to AKT, which is I just saw this morning, which is fascinating, right? So I think we're going to see quite a bit
Yeah.
of that trend where you have different ecosystems, be it Ethereum, be it Solana, be it Near, be it Avalanche, all connect, or Polkadot, as a matter of fact, all connect to each other and all exchanging value in a frictionless and in a safe way. I think that is going to open up a whole lot of possibilities with atomic composability, right? I love to see like what you can do with Akash is it's a permissionless way to provision cloud resources that never existed before, right? Like and an amazing price point, right? At a market-driven price point. So I think like so what can you do? What kind of like programs can you build with this, right? Like it's not like you have to
Mhm.
rely on Amazon and Amazon shuts you down, you're done, right? Like imagine rebuilding a Heroku on Akash, how that's going to look like, right? Like so we're going to see a lot of possibilities, I think, with Web3 that I can't like say for specifically and what's going to happen, but I think a common theme is going to be open marketplaces and open exchange of value. Yeah.
Terrific. Um, have you seen either at Akash or maybe through reading some reports and news, has the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, has that accelerated the demand for cloud computing in general and maybe specifically decentralized cloud computing?
Oh yeah, humongous, right? We're seeing they're outliers. Now everybody cloud it's a cloud first world, especially with the pandemic, right? I mean, cloud became the collaborative fabric, right? So there is
Hmm.
no if you're not on the cloud, I don't know how you can collaborate being remote, right? So definitely the need for cloud has increased, and we can't quite say I haven't seen this year's reports yet, but I can tell with a fair degree of certainty that we beat the estimates, right? At least by a few points. Um, and I think
Sure.
a lot of that came from the need to collaborate remotely on the cloud. Last I checked, we were doing somewhere north of 44 uh, trillion bytes, so of data, and that's more than the known stars in the universe or something like that. Crazy numbers, right? Right.
Yeah.
So I think we exceeded that quite a bit. Yeah, more data, the more cloud. And
Probably is,
this market is not slowing down. It's about to be a
yeah,
trillion
yeah.
dollar market very soon. Yeah,
It's probably still not more grains of sand on Earth, but yeah,
we're getting there.
it's certainly getting up
Yeah.
there. Yeah. um, Around the point you made earlier of so much computing capacity being underused or unused at any one point in time because all these companies typically build for peak demand. Do you think maybe in the long run, cloud computing, or especially decentralized cloud computing, that's more affordable and maybe more a higher baseline? Do you think that that can have a significant impact on the environment or environmental sustainability?
Yeah, I think so. So right now, so the biggest cost in a data center right now is not the cloud computing itself, it's cooling of the systems, right? So one of the
Hmm.
things I really like about, well, so cooling of the systems because you have concentration of heat, right? These data centers run large
Right.
systems, and you know, uh, and in order to cool, they really need to use enormous amounts of commercial power, and that's where the cost comes from. I think when you decentralize systems, you effectively decentralized that element energy consumption itself, right? I think that's a lot better from a sustainable standpoint instead of like concentrating into one data center, right? So Amazon builds this massive uh, hyperscale data centers, we call them, and the amount of cost to spend, the amount of energy to spend to cool these systems is like enormous, right? Like, I rather see a more
Yeah,
decentralized footprint, where I mean, it'd be great to see like data centers like in the Arctic, right? In the Arctic that
sure,
that
absolutely.
can leverage. I mean, we are seeing some in Iceland or whatnot, but I'd love to see more investments go there. I think decentralization is going to enable that because right now, today, it's very hard to enter the data center game and compete with Amazon, right? There's no competitive advantage you get, and they're going to win the battle. I mean, they have so much money
Hmm.
and they have so much like marketability. It's very hard for someone to like just spin up a data center and expect to earn money. With Akash, that's possible, right? So people are going to figure out more
Right.
sustainable ways to do so because end of the day, it comes down to cost per gigabyte, right? So if you have more sustainable mechanism, it's going to reduce your cost, right? So um, I think decentralization is going to open up opportunities to have more more compute capacity online, which can come from places that are a lot more sustainable. Uh, and now you suddenly don't have the competitive moat that you need to otherwise build to compete with Amazon, but you can just simply go to Akash and have the compute available to you, or have that
Cool.
opportunity
I
available
think
to you.
that's fair.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. A couple of final questions here. Do you think the future of privacy is buying and selling our own personal data?
Um, well, you are selling your personal data right now, you know, if you like it or not. And right,
I think it's mostly the not part right now.
yeah,
Yeah, depending on the platforms you choose, right? That's it's obviously highly dependent on your digital hygiene and your behavior online. Not entirely. Sometimes you literally don't have a choice as soon as you touch the internet. But a good portion of that is very much like I use this service and they're collecting my data and they're selling it to advertisers.
right. So that's how
And the only
they're
way to stop that is to stop using that service.
correct. So, um, so obviously, I mean, so obviously, you are selling your data without consent for the most part, and
Hmm.
I think the future is consent, right? So for folks that want to sell their data and want to get the experience of a personalized, you know, advert, uh, people should have that option. For people that are more privacy concerned, people should, have that option as well. And I think the future is about sovereignty, right? It's not about reduced capability.
Hmm.
Obviously, I mean, there are I mean, ads could. I like personal ads. I like to get personalized, um, highly targeted advertising versus not, right? Versus some random
Right.
like ad that I have to sit through and watch no matter what. I hate those things, right? But if there's an ad that's actually like serving my needs, I don't mind paying that with my data, right, as a cost, right? Um, I think privacy in the future is going to hopefully uh, is going to be a lot more sovereign. Uh, you as a user are going to have a lot more control as to what data that you want to sell versus what data you don't want to sell. You guys are doing quite a bit to help in the future of privacy, right? You guys are doing more important stuff about like, hey, actually, there are really bad people that are snooping in on your package and trying to shut you down and not have a voice. I mean,
Right.
that's another kind of like extreme about privacy. That's what happens when we give people control about your private lives, right? Like, sure, getting nice ads is one thing, but
Yeah.
people can actually abuse the privacy and do something a lot more damaging. Is crazy, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think sovereignty is going to be the name of the game.
Okay. Fair enough. And finally, how do you protect your privacy online?
Me personally, I mean, I can't disclose things that I'm not
Yeah.
supposed to disclose, but considering my profile.
I don't want to know your Finsta username or anything like that. I'm just some basic steps that you do. Like I use a VPN. I use incognito mode. Sometimes that sort of thing.
So I prefer privacy first products, right? I don't use Google as much as possible. I use Proton Mail. I use Brave browser, and I use a VPN,
Hmm.
right? And I just don't want my IP address, and I don't want my location to be available to people, in general, right? Um, and uh, and uh, I use a standard stack. I use YubiKey to encrypt my stuff. Uh, Use
Cool.
various degrees of password managers, various levels of password management security, that has a physical component to it. Without a physical component, you're not going to be able to access any of these password managers, right? Um, Anything that's secure, I keep it away from a cloud, right? I keep it in physical storage, right? I don't touch a
Yeah.
cloud. Anything that even your memory can be can be swooped. So I don't like anything that touches my memory of my computer in general. So that's where I get
Okay.
really into it, right? So people don't realize how bad memory can be, or your clipboard. People can attack your clipboard, right? I've seen a lot of attacks that happen on clipboards, right?
Yeah. We saw that a few years ago with an Intel vulnerability. Actually, a couple of vulnerabilities that I believe, if I recall correctly, mostly on Windows, but it was
Yeah.
cross-platform that allowed somebody to. I think they had to have physical access to your device, but regardless, there was a vulnerability there that allowed people to attack your clipboard, get data out of it. And potentially that could be a password, or it could be a private key, or it could be um, health data that you're copying and pasting from one place to another in order to put it in a more secure place, something like that. So
Do not
yeah, that's
copy
that's
anything
that's a
that's
good point to
private.
make.
Like, do not hit the Command C. There's that risk. You don't know what's running on your computer, right? Like, I refresh my computer
Yeah.
every periodically, very lot more often. I don't do not um, the amount of devices that I trust are very, very minimal. You know, and I also
Hmm.
refresh that trust very quickly, right? Much more rapidly. I format my computer every month or something. Probably. And I try to like
Okay.
keep the computer or my devices uh, in a single point of failure, right? So I purposefully refresh these things, so I'm always rechecking my backups, my always validating my readiness, right? I'm always like checking my readiness, right? Every time something goes down, right? So I have multiple devices as backups for my keys and whatnot, but I'm always like taking them down. I'm always doing this whole exercise of recovery. It's not so much, faults happen, right? Like, so there's only so you can be as secure as possible, but there's no guarantee that's going to be the ultimate like protection. I think it really comes down to
Hmm.
is fault tolerance, right? What happens in a case that you get attacked, right? So you have your how do you trace
Right.
something? How do you recover? First of all, how do you come back, right? What happens if I get swim swapped? I got swim swapped, like it happens a lot, right? So I don't have my phone tied to anything. Absolutely. My phone number at all tied to my identity. My email address not tied to my identity, right? So like um,
Mm.
um, for anything that's critical, at least. I mean, there's some like drizzly.com or something that got hacked and had my email address tied to my identity, right? Like, that's fine, but I'm also very prepared, right? So all my all of my details are public at this point, right? Like, anyone that's been in the space for a while
Sure.
should assume that, right? Equinox, not Equinox, the credit agency thing that got hacked, put all your social security and everything,
Equifax.
Equifax,
Yeah.
right? Um, so always like being on the alert that you could get hacked, right? And like there's no guarantee that you won't. And I think testing your readiness is a big portion of staying secure.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to end on. I used to do research for IT businesses, or for IT departments at small, medium, and enterprise businesses, and the number of business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans that were never tested was absolutely mind-boggling. So you're actually going through this process really often of effectively putting your your BCP or your DRP to the test in formatting your computer and more or less starting from scratch, downloading backups or restoring backups that are local or through the cloud, through the Akash cloud potentially, and things like that. So
One thing I
good for
can
you.
never get right is my dot files. No matter how many times I install them, I gotta change things.
Sorry, your dot
My
files.
dot files is the dot bash scripts that get run on the
Oh, okay.
first
Yes.
time your computer boots up. So I
Yeah.
have this very customized dot files that I've been maintaining for 14 years, that you got to install every time, because you're reformatting your computer. So, and that always
Yeah.
always gets interesting.
All right. Well, Greg, thanks so much for your time today. You're very generous with it, and I hope everybody enjoyed listening to this episode of Private Podcast.
Thanks, Derek. I'm looking forward to listening as well, and had such a good time. Thanks for having me.